because of these lights, but it's just nature of the beast. So it's what it is. So, and there'll be opportunities. This is the attendance, but there'll be opportunities. You, like I said, that the sheets are up here, or I can show this to you at the end. We're supposed to go until 11:30. So I will be very thoughtful that 11:30 is when lunch starts, and everybody likes to be in line appropriately at lunch, so I will be very thoughtful of your time as far as getting you out of here on time. All right, so adolescence and risky behavior. One of the things, or just the adolescent brain is the other title for this, which is just really thinking about the neurology of adolescence, the unique experiences of adolescent neurological development. It's not quite as boring as it sounds. It's actually, I think, a very interesting thing to consider. This is one of my favorite things to talk about these days, is the idea of how our better understanding of adolescent neurology will help us to be more effective in the interventions we have, the perceptions we have, and considering it. So I think this is important. One thing I did want to mention too as well, while I'm here, I've got this session, then there's a break, and then I have, of course, there's lunch, and then there's another break, and then I present at the end. While I'm here, if there's anything I can do to help, I'll work for you today. So if there's questions you have or anything like that, don't hesitate to ask or let me know if there's anything I can do to help. I always tell people don't hesitate to do so while I'm here working with you. I always tell people the adolescent brain is a scary place to go alone. That's why I like this picture. Is because if you think to your adolescence, it's a really tough time. And I think when you remember what it was like to be an adolescent, especially, like as we get older, we think of adolescent issues as sometimes less than, like that's, it's kid issues. But when you were that age, it was a big deal. It was a really big deal. So I want to talk a little bit about that. I've already, in the keynote, we already talked about the ideas of, adolescent development, or at least the better question of what's wrong with kids these days versus what do kids need these days. Same thing goes with this. We're still thinking about that acceptance and growth continuum, right? We're still thinking about understanding the unique differences of that kid, but then also pushing that kid to be a better version of themselves. We're always keeping that acceptance and growth side of things. This presentation, the reason why I think it can be very relevant is because it helps improve our acceptance understanding of kids, but also helps us understand what are the key developmental tasks of adolescence from a neurological standpoint. What are the key things that kids need to be doing through adolescence to get themselves prepared for adulthood? So that's a lot of what we're going to talk about. So the first thing we start to get into is this concept of even what is adolescence? Like how do we even define such a thing? And I think there's three components that we want to consider. And one is physical maturity. The second is economic independence or psychological independence. And the last is economic independence. So physical maturity. Now what makes physical maturity tricky is these different ideas. Is early maturation is a thing. We're seeing kids enter into puberty at earlier and earlier ages. So what it used to be is a little bit more tight as far as the age range of when puberty would have onset, but now what we're starting to see is that this is actually quite interesting. We're seeing that some kids are hitting early and some kids are having late onset. So what we're seeing is a big range. So it used to be kind of packed, kind of tight, and now we're starting to see that range kind of widen. So we're having kids hit it earlier, but also kids having late onset as well. And then people always will say, like, why? And that's one of those questions I think that doesn't have an answer. It has multiple answers. So I think there's a lot of things that can be contributing to early onset and late onset. The big things you see in the research are going to be obesity, nutrition issues, exposure to chemicals, so on. So those are going to be, but people can't say it's that thing. And it's kind of like, I do a lot of work around autism, and you can't say it's a thing. Like, it's just wrong. So there's multiple things that can contribute to a certain pattern of behaviors or neurological profile that we see, and the same thing goes with early maturation. I think what makes it tricky, though, is we're having younger and younger kids reach sexual maturity, but their neurology, as far as we can tell, and their maturity level from a psychological standpoint is not hitting earlier. they're still, always makes me nervous, is they're, little kids driving Corvettes. And it's scary. They got lots of horsepower, but no handling. And I think they're walking in bodies that their minds really aren't ready to drive yet. So, looking at, and these other two things that we look at, is psychological independence and economic independence, is tricky because of the independent skills needed. So let me talk about these two real quick. Psychological independence is the ability to solve problems psychologically that is developed within a developmentally appropriate way. So what do I mean by that? I changed things around, of course, when I talk about specific clients that I worked with, but I had a young lady that I worked with. She was really high achieving academically, scored 30-something on her ACTs, had a 4-point whatever GPA, but she couldn't schedule a doctor's appointment because she would say, my anxiety's too bad, I can't schedule a doctor's appointment. Now, that's a real issue for me, because she may be academically capable and quite capable in that way, but if the proxy of her independent skills is she can't even schedule a doctor's appointment, that's going to limit her ability to express her intellect. So if I have a kid, and I'm seeing more and more, I work on a college campus, so I see a lot of this, is I see a lot of academically capable young people who are psychologically immature. And so that concerns me. And what we talk about is, how do we help kids develop those skills? How do we help kids to be able to solve problems, schedule a doctor's appointment, order their own food, those kinds of things, which seems kind of trivial, but I'm sure those of you that work with adolescents know that we're having more and more kids where they're struggling with what we would call basic independent living skills. And we got to figure out ways to help kids develop those skills. I had a kid I was working with one time, and I was talking to him and his mom, and I did the I can question, like, what can he do? And they're like, well, what do you mean? And so I asked some questions, and one of the questions I asked is, can he order his own food at a restaurant? And the mom said, well, he can, but he gets real nervous, so it's just easier if I order for him. And I said, okay. I said, here's the challenge. Because I had met this kid and knew this kid well enough to tell that he was cognitively capable of ordering his own food. It wasn't because he couldn't. It was because she didn't want him to be uncomfortable. So I said to her, he can order his own food. From my clinical assessment, he is capable of ordering his own food. I said, here's my worry, that if he doesn't order his own food, then he's going to continue to be dependent on you to order his own food, and at some point, that's going to be an issue for him for independence. Now, some people might say, well, how do you deal with that? Well, so I'm not saying that I'm going to drag this kid to McDonald's and go, order your food, you can do it. No. I have to consider, all right, this kid has autism, so he's probably got a social communication deficit, or for certain, just to have that diagnosis. He has a social communication deficit. So what am I going to do? I'm going to take from an acceptance perspective and say, he probably needs scripts, he needs to practice, he needs to work with me and his mom separate from being in the game, so to speak. He needs more practice before it's time to go in the game. So I'm not just saying pull kids up by their bootstraps kind of thing. What I'm saying is understanding what he needs to do to develop that psychological independence. Economic independence. So that's one that I think is really tricky these days. Now, I don't want to step on any toes, but I want to mention that there can be an overcorrection when it comes to economic independence. Economic independence is the ability at a commensurate age to handle your financial responsibilities. So a young adult, I would say things like to pay rent. In adolescence, I would say their ability to manage a bank account, to save money, to spend money, to know how much money they have, which is much easier now with apps and so on and so forth. But so the ability to have economic independence that's developmentally appropriate. Here's the thing I think we got to be careful of, especially for parents of young adults, is I see more and more people using economic security as a hindrance toward independent living advancement. So what I mean by that is keeping kids in the house longer into early adulthood and saying it's better if you just stay here and save your money at the expense of, here's what worries me. And now, are there reasons why some young people cannot leave their home because of a disability, because of a mental health challenge, and things like that? Are those situations? Of course there are. Of course there are. But I do see sometimes where we are holding kids in the house in the spirit of economic independence but at the expense of independent living independence. Now, are there kids that can pull this off and develop adulthood in their childhood home? Yes. I do have kids that I've worked with that have been able to do that. But it's more difficult than easy, I would say. Because I always say this when I talk to parents about this. It's hard, I'll use a male as an example. It's hard to learn how to be a man in a house where you're a boy. You can't have a 21-year-old with a LeBron James poster in their childhood bedroom eating Lucky Charms with their mom at 8 in the morning. It's hard to develop you when you're still that 7-year-old self-eating Lucky Charms in the kitchen with your mom or your dad. And one of the things that I say, and like I said, this isn't a must, but I want people to really think about this. And the reason why I want to really think about this is there may be times where we take on some economic risk because we need to develop independence. Because I tell Jake this all the time, he's my 18-year-old. In your early adulthood years, prioritize experience over money. Because experience will pay you in the future. The money you're going to make when you're 18 to 20-some-year-old is nothing compared to what you can make whenever you actually have something to offer. So in the early parts of your career, in the early parts of your life, you prioritize experience over money because that experience builds the person that can make the most money later. So if I'm telling this kid, save your rent money by living in the basement, but they don't develop independent living skills, then they're going to be delayed in their social emotional development, which means they're not going to be able to, they're going to be delayed in their ability to execute, to lead, to do those kinds of things. And I just want this one is a tricky one I see now, especially with middle and upper class families. I see this to be a real challenge, but something to think about. But again, are there kids that pull it off? Yep. I got a friend of mine, they got a son, and he's very independent, does his own thing, but he's always kind of been that guy. And so it's stuff to think about. And this is what we see also with the independent skills. There is an increased social complexity. Now, job skill requirement, this is a shift I'm noticing now, which is encouraging. Back in the day, my dad, I'll give you a sense of my family's background. My mom was a school teacher for 32 years, high school teacher. My dad, my great-grandfather was a Boilermaker on the Harris side in Virginia. My grandfather worked in the steel mill for 32 years. My dad worked in that same steel mill until like the 80s, and then he got laid off because the mills were all shutting down where I lived. And then he became a gymnastics instructor, which is real common for men to leave steel and go right into gymnastics. That's a true story. That's actually what he did. It's a long story, better told in the bar. But so very kind of blue-collar-ish kind of idea about the way things went. But my dad, one of the big things, and some of you may have been raised in this, but because my dad had such a bad sense of working in the mill because he got laid off, it was always like me growing up, get your degree. Get your degree. You can't count on being able to work in the steel mill. You can't count on this. It was all like, get a degree because that was going to guarantee economic security. Now I would say, I tell kids all the time when we start looking at a higher ed, is I tell kids, are you sure you want to go to college? And I work for a university. But what I tell kids is, you're in a better landscape now than I was coming out of school because of the trades having a reemergence, and that we know that career and tech now, we have kids going into career and tech and getting certification and licensure companies are coming to our career and tech ed places to recruit kids out of the programs early because we need more workers. And on the other side of that, the thing I challenge about higher ed is higher ed can be so expensive sometimes. I tell kids, be careful graduating with a bachelor's degree in history with $150,000 worth of student loan debt. And you're really not employable because that degree, and nothing against a degree in history, unless you got a teaching degree, you're not employable because a degree in history or psychology, for example, doesn't really qualify you to do anything. So I tell kids now is actually a really interesting economy where you can really explore what you want to do because there's more options than there were in a previous. So I tell, when you're talking to adolescents, especially when it comes to job requirements, it's not just college or bust. There's all kinds of good options now, and I think the economy, hopefully, is going to maintain that we can have that as well. And I just talked about increased family control. And I think this is one of the big things we need to be talking about is how much of how much developmental opportunities are we compromising in late adolescence and especially early adulthood by the increased surveillance of kids? I'm going to use the word surveillance like the FBI, right? I mean, again, I'm just trying to get people thinking. I'm not trying to be controversial or just upset anybody, but I look at, people that still can tell how fast their 23-year-old kid drove to work today. Like, is that really, do we really need to know that our 23-year-old kid went 36 and a 35 on his way to work this morning? Really thinking about, I think there's an element of safety, which is using things like Find My or whatever it might be, but then there comes an element where in the spirit of safety we've moved into surveillance, and now we've got, imagine what it's like. There's certain things we use that adult, constantly has someone looking over their shoulder. So I think thinking about at what point are we starting to compromise the development of independence because we have increased surveillance and control, which I've got a 23, 24-year-old who doesn't really know what it's like to be in charge of themselves. Or to have hey, I noticed you went kind of fast on the highway today. You got to be thinking about your safety on their way to their job as an attorney, right? Or something like that. Stuff to think about. So what happens in adolescence? It's these things, right? I start to figure out who I am. Trying to get a sense of who I am in society. Trying to consider these things based on skills. This is one thing I tell kids all the time. Society pays you by what value you can add. Society pays you based on what it is you contribute. So your job as an adolescent is to develop something that someone will want to pay for later. Your job in school, your job in career and tech, your job is to develop skills and things that someone will see valuable enough to pay you for later. And being handsome or being whatever is all fine and good, but people don't, unless you're a model, don't pay for that stuff. So what do we find is, what our job is, goes back to that I can idea. In adolescence, we need to develop their sense of the I can statement. Because self-concept is based on content. What things have I accomplished? And it's also based on challenge. We talk about all these kind of things like, there's only certain theories that apply to a lot of things. And progressive overload is the way that a muscle develops, which is you stress it just a little bit outside of its range, and then it rests and it grows. You stress it a little bit outside of its range, then it rests and it grows. And then the other the concept we commonly know in education is zone of proximal development, or scaffolding, which was Vygotsky's ideas, right? Which is this idea that we support you, but we push you just outside your range, and you grow and you learn. And then we push you just outside your range, and you grow and you learn. So we have to be pushing kids. Now, the thing I'm always thoughtful of is I've got to push kids in areas where they can have some success in order to develop that sense of what we talked about earlier, that rational optimism, which is my behavior matters. Because if I'm just pushing a kid in an area where they're weak and they're continuing to fail, well, I'm building the psychology of my behavior doesn't matter because I don't create those outcomes. And also, and I'll talk a lot about this in just a minute, it's also based on relationships. It's also based on the sense of who I am and the relationships I have with other people. So here's the neurology of when we look at the human brain in a very, very simple way. That it's very much a work in progress. So if you think about a lizard, when a lizard is born, it hatches from the egg, it's ready to do lizardly things, right? It doesn't have to go to like a preschool where it learns like claws are not for scratching and these are the bugs we eat or anything like that. When a lizard is born, its brain is basically, it's a small adult lizard is the best way to think about it. It can do all the things it needs to do because its brain is pretty much fixed. It doesn't change much through its life. Now think about a human baby. Human babies are basically good at nothing. That's no offense to babies. But they're not good at anything except upsetting us. Like I always say, babies are designed to control and upset you. And that's not a mean thing. It's because when a baby's born, it can cry. And that's the primary driver of its survival. It cries, which the cry draws you in, which helps you meet their needs. So the only thing a human baby can do well in the beginning is basic autonomic functions and cry in order to get their needs met. And because it takes a human brain so long to develop, some would argue an independent human brain could be anywhere from 13 to 17 years old as far as like basic care for themselves. That's a long, long time in the animal kingdom. It takes a really, really long time to develop that brain in that situation. The two developmental principles of the human brain that are important to remember, one is learning and growth takes place in the context of relationships, which I talked about earlier. So like for example, babies develop language by people talking to them. If you don't talk to a child, they will not develop language. That's called an experience-expectant experience. So we know that they take place in the pattern. It's also in the idea of the brain is a pattern-seeking device. I think I've got it. So I think about the brain being a pattern-seeking device is this sequence of things. Think about it like this. A brain looks at, like a baby watches something. I'll just give us in a sense. It says A plus B equals C. A plus B equals C. And then what starts to happen is the baby starts to anticipate. Why is pattern recognition so important? Pattern recognition is so important because my ability to recognize patterns means I can start to predict the future. And the brain's job is to keep me alive. So how does it keep me alive? It helps me anticipate what's coming next. So A plus B equals C is just my way of finding a pattern, and then if I see A, B, C, and then later I see A and B, I can anticipate C and prepare myself physically and emotionally for what I need to do in order to deal with C. So the brain is a pattern-seeking device. Whether it's a kindergartner learning primary colors or a senior learning physics, there's just pattern recognition. All I'm doing is learning patterns. So these two components are the most are the key elements of neurological development, which is pattern recognition and the context of relationships. And I showed you this last time, and it's a little different picture, but the idea of that learning takes place in the context of relationships goes back to that idea of risk-taking is a function of learning. So when I look at how young people develop their sense of learning or how they learn, it's that risk-taking, but the risk-taking within the context of relationships. Now, if you're working with adolescents, especially those, I assume most people in here are middle school, high school folks, one of the things that we know is we have to really work hard with this ability to build relationships because naturally adolescents start to push away a little bit, and I'll talk about why in just a minute. They naturally start to push away in those, especially 7-12 range. And I'll talk about that more later. So the two main things that are happening, just to kind of be to get into the neurology for just a second, during this period of adolescence, during this period of puberty, is these two main concepts. It's more than just a bunch of hormones, okay? There's other things happening. So the best way I could teach you is like this. If you guys have like a closet where all your stuff goes. Anybody got like a closet that's got too much stuff in it? And like you're like, I need to organize that closet, right? If you're going to organize that closet, what's the first thing you have to do to get started? What's the first thing you have to do? Take it all out, right? Good answer, right? So we're going to take it all out. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to open that closet, you're going to take it all out, and you're going to lay it all out, all your stuff. And then you're going to start looking at all the stuff. And you're going to start deciding if you're going to keep it or you're going to get rid of it. And whether you keep it or get rid of it is based on, does this apply to you anymore? So you might look and say, oh, there's rollerblades. I'm probably never going to rollerblade again. I could probably get rid of those. Or that jacket. Probably never going to wear that jacket again, right? So what you do is you slowly kind of go through your stuff and you get rid of the things that don't apply to you anymore, okay? What that is from a neurological standpoint, when an adolescent is in puberty or in that developmental burst, the brain kind of comes apart in a way, kind of a way of thinking about it. And so synaptic pruning, which is the pruning, or like you prune a tree, the trimming of networks that I don't need anymore, which is the same way of like getting rid of my rollerblades. I don't need this connection anymore because I'm not using it anymore. And I want the brain to become more efficient. So the second thing you do then is you put everything back in a more efficient way so it's faster to get to it.
Now, what the brain does is what's called myelinization. So myelinization is, there's this cable right here. You see this cord. This cord has like a rubber coating on it. Okay, the brain, the same way it goes with our neurons and the communication between the axons, there's a cord basically, or a channel, and that channel gets wrapped with fat, and that fat is called myelin. And myelin, as it thickens, the electrical communication inside that myelin becomes faster. So what happens in adolescence is I start to get rid of the stuff I don't use and get faster at the things I do. This is also why experiencing trauma at this point in life is very, very difficult, or can be very, very disruptive, because the brain is open in a way, and that when it's open, it's vulnerable. So if I experience trauma during this period of time, the same way it happens in early childhood, there's also an opening period in early childhood, is that can really disrupt the way my brain comes back together from a neurological standpoint. So that's why, wow, it's really important, things like bullying or things like trauma, sexual abuse, domestic violence, those kinds of things can really affect the neurology of an adolescent for the rest of their life if it happens during this period of synaptic pruning and myelinization. So that's why it's really important that we're really supporting kids during this time. So that's what's really happening at this time. It's not just a bunch of hormones. People are, hey, kids and their hormones. Hormones are important, but the hormones are really kind of what are catalysts for other things. And I'll talk about that more as we go. So when we're looking at the adolescent brain, the goal is these two sides of things. And I always think about this. Think of the brain as an orchestra. Okay? And what we want is what's called integration and differentiation. Integration is just like it sounds. It's the way the brain plays together. But in order for the brain to play together well, you have to have what's called differentiation, which is, in order for an orchestra to sound great, each person has to be able to play their instrument really well. And then you have to have a conductor who helps with the timing and the integration of the different sounds of the different instruments. So if I look at what adolescent brains are trying to do, or human brains in general, is I want the separate regions to be strong, but also play together, which is what creates behavior. I'll show you in just a minute what part of the brain does that. But at this point, in the goal of adolescent development, what I'm trying to create is impulse balance. The ability to think but not always do. The way to regulate my feelings and my emotions. I'm balancing my impulses. I'm mad at this adult, but I know if I talk back to this adult, there'll be consequences for me later, so I don't say something back to this adult. I go to my job at Subway, not because I love being a sandwich artist, but because I love the money that they give me every 2 weeks. So I start to delay, and I start to work on my impulses. I learn about flexibility in thinking. And some of the disorders that we work with in mental health that are really important that we address are a lack of flexibility. Like if I work with a kid with autism, sometimes kids with autism, one of the things they struggle with is they can be inflexible, meaning it's black or white. So one of the things I'm really working with a kid like that is to try to expand the gray. But being flexible in thought, a lot of times in adolescence is showing maturity. To understand that I may believe this, but somebody else may not believe this because of the difference in their experiences. So I start looking at that flexibility. They start looking at, I really think this is important, to really challenge adolescents to start thinking about what ethics and rules are. How, like, we start really considering rules. It's like, you should listen to authority figures, but not all the time. Because there's certain people who might present themselves as an authority figure that you shouldn't listen to. Or like a 6-year-old, you should listen to authority figure seems like a pretty basic idea, but if I've got a 15-year-old, then I want that 15-year-old considering who is the authority figure and whether I really want to listen to this person or whether it's safe to listen to this person. So I want kids to start being, or even things, putting them thinking about moral dilemmas. You know, people will say lying is bad. But are there situations where somebody might lie for a greater good? Those are things we challenge kids to think about and to consider. Complexity of thought, and also too, this is a big thing we spend a lot of time talking to kids about, is just the concept of goals. You know, it amazes me how much time we don't spend helping kids even consider what goal setting is. How do we set goals? How do we consider goals? How do we explore goals? I'll talk about that a little bit more as we go. But we get so fixated on whatever kind of outcome academically we're moving toward, we're not helping a kid understand how this fits into their goals. I'll give you a quick example. I had a kid I was working with one time, and he was failing a few of his classes as a freshman. And we know that if you fail, obviously, when you start failing classes as a freshman, your chances of having a very negative academic outcome are high. Okay? Two things we know that are big negative indicators for high school kids are if they've been suspended and failing grades their freshman year. So that's why when I go into schools, I really want people to focus on suspensions and detentions and things like that, because we know that kids that are suspended at a high rate are exponentially more likely to drop out or at least low perform. And the other one, we know is that kids who fail a lot their freshman year, that track record's hard to get out of that hole. And it also shows not just a grade issue, but probably some sort of soft skill issue or skill issue when it comes to studying and things like that. So helping kids create goals. So I had this kid, he was failing a bunch of classes, and I said, listen, you're going to be short on credits. And he kind of did the I don't care, And I said, you're going to have to take this class, you're going to have to take these two classes over again next year. And I said, and you're going to be in a class with freshmen, and you're going to be a sophomore. And what was weird about it is, he goes, so I got to take this over again. I said, yes, you will have to take this over again, because they didn't have a credit recovery for summer. And I'm like, yes, you're going to have to take the class over again, and you are going to be the only sophomore with a bunch of freshmen. And he goes, well, I don't want to do that. I don't want to look stupid. And I'm like, okay, well, what do you want to do about it? So his goal, I wasn't going to be like, don't you want to graduate with that? If his goal was, I don't want to look stupid because I don't want to be the only sophomore in the freshman class, we're going to work from there. That's where I'm going to work with. And he was like, I don't want people to think. So that's where I'm going to work from. That's how I'm going to consider. One of the big things we come into in adolescence is this ability to make decisions. Now, here's an important fact to consider. At 15 to 25 years old is your peak time to die from an accident. Okay? It makes sense, right? Makes sense why that's the peak time, because that's when you do the most dumb stuff. Right? It's actually when you're supposed to do most of your dumb stuff. It's 15 to 25. It's not abnormal. It's actually quite normal. Now, do I want people to say, and what's interesting about this is, what's really strange is this is actually risk-taking behavior in adolescence is actually down. Let me give you an example. Things like car accidents and promiscuous sexual behavior is actually down. Why? How's that possible? How's that possible? How are those indicators that we would see as risk-taking behavior down? Yep, that's one. Yeah. Yes. Yep. Exactly. It's a lack of pro-social engagement outside of the home environment. And when we talk about cars, fewer and fewer kids are getting their license at 16. Have you noticed that? Has anybody else noticed that? Yeah. If you listen to reasons why they say they don't get their license, it's at least a top 3 reason. Depending on who you're reading, it could be 1 through 3. Is one of the main reasons why those 16-year-olds are saying they're not getting their license is their anxiety. They're nervous. Now, are there reasons why, again, nothing's black and white. Are there kids that I genuinely believe they have a neurological difference that we have to be thoughtful in how we teach them how to drive, especially when I work with kids with autism or kids with certain clinical disorders? I do think we have to think about how we teach them differently. But I still want them to learn. But then if I have a kid who's quote-unquote neurotypical, who's not getting their license because they just rather stay in the room and their parents can take them wherever and so on and so forth, that worries me, because if I don't have my license, that's a huge first step in independence, which is a venturing away from the home. And then again, if I don't venture away from the home, then I'm not gaining those developmental experiences, which means I'm going to not have, I'm going to struggle with work. I'm going to struggle with pro-social. I'm not going to go out on dates. I'm not going to do these things. So my world is small, and I'm not experiencing the world, which means I'm going to be socially, emotionally delayed. And I don't mean that in like I mean that literally. I will have experiences that I've missed out on, which delay my development of what I'm supposed to be at 18. So what I see a lot of are 19, 20-year-olds who are socially, emotionally 16. But they're in college, but they're not ready for the independent living side of things. And I think that's one side. And the other side is I'm not out doing things. Now, am I like saying like we should be like rooting kids on for sexually promiscuous behavior? No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying there's some of that is just the natural progression of adolescence. We still should be very thoughtful of educating kids on safe and appropriate sexual behavior, risk-taking, and stuff like that. But there's an element of I should want kids to be kind of exploring things within their realm of experience, within their realm of comfort. You're going to have some kids, and this is probably true for different people in different environments. There might have been some folks who are a little more wild than others. And there might have been some kids that really didn't want to go do the keg party in the field. But it's the opportunity to explore and try things out, which then expands and weighs that risk. Because I want kids to make mistakes when the stakes are low. I want them to, and I'll talk about this more about relationships in just a minute, I want kids to kind of try on some of these different things and do some risk-taking while the stakes are low and there's mentoring relationships involved. I want those kind of things to occur. Now, what's interesting is, this is from a weird neurological standpoint, is we know that adolescents actually can weigh risk. We'd say, like, they're just not thinking about it. Kids actually can weigh risk. But the difference is, I always think about this, there's one kid I can think in my mind that was a skateboarding kid, and he taught me about risk. And I'm like, do you know what could happen if you don't land that? Like, you can break your collarbone, break your wrist, and all this kind of stuff. He goes, yeah, I know. And he goes, but what if I landed? And I think that's the difference in understanding adolescence is, it's not always that they can't weigh risk, it's that they overvalue the pro-social element of, what if I do it? And now they can record it. So not only do I land it, but someone records it, and then we post it, and now look at all this social currency I'm gaining from this thing that I did. So it's not that kids just don't understand risk-taking. It's they understand risk-taking, but they overvalue the reward of landing it, so to speak. So I think that's something that we kind of think, and they have a peak sensitivity to dopamine, which I'll talk about dopamine more later when I talk about different apps and TikTok and all that kind of stuff. I'll kind of unpack that more as I go. But looking at this idea that they especially value social reward and risk-taking. And one of the things we do know also when we look at risk-taking and personality and belonging, you'll even have kids that they will compromise elements of their personality in order to belong. And we'll talk about that more as we go, but I think one of the things to consider is human beings are social creatures, which means we run in groups. If we go to the animal world and kind of study that a little more closely, anything that runs in groups, like pack animals or herd animals, if you get separated from the group, you're in danger. Whether it's a wolf or a horse or whatever, when you separate from the group, you're in danger. Okay? And I'll talk about that more as I go, but you will have kids that you have to understand that is a basic evolutionary concept in our neurology. We also know that they're going to seek stuff, go try new things. I think this is critically important. A slight aside, if we talk about like kids should develop grit, one of the things we don't think about when we talk about the development of grit, and Angela Duckworth's book, which I really encourage people to read, which is titled Grit, one of the things that she talks about, which I think is critically important, is exposing kids to lots of activities early in life. Exposing kids to different things. I'm a I've been a coach, and I love athletics, and I'm a has-been athlete. But one of the things I think we got to be really careful about, that I see a trend that's really affecting kids, is early specialization in athletics. You know, we got 8 and 9-year-olds who are committing to a sport at 8 or 9. And what happens is, why I think that's so tricky or so complicated, is because at 8 or 9, we're picking a path for a kid, and they're doing that thing, and all the family currency, sometimes even financial currency, but especially time currency, starts to become invested in travel this or travel that, and we're spending our weekends in hotels. And I'm not saying that's necessarily all bad, but what I'm saying is we have to be careful that we don't predispose or presuppose an identity on a kid at 8 or 9, and then by the time they're 10 or 12 or whatever, the whole family identity is connected to this kid doing this thing. That even if he wanted to stop doing it, he couldn't. Or she couldn't. Because so much of our family's identity is connected to this thing. And what Duckworth talks about is importance, especially in the elementary and early middle, moving into early high school, is exposing kids to all different types of activities. Because that gives them an opportunity to explore things that they might like and to create diversity in their personality as opposed to that thing. And it really is and I don't, I'm writing an article on it right now, but I think it is tricky, and I understand how people can be kind of brought into it, because for parents it becomes tricky because it starts to be, you're not being a good parent to your kid if your kid shows any semblance of talent in some area, and you don't automatically dump $15,000 a year in that kid doing their specialized activity at 9, 10, or 12 years old. There's just like this pressure of, well, if you really want your kid to be a D1 athlete, blah, 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 whatever, then I've got to start investing in them at this age. And so part of the problem that runs into that is the kid never gets to try new stuff. So their personality becomes very narrow and singular. Now, is that altogether a bad thing? Have I seen kids that have done that before and come out to be very high-achieving, capable young people? Absolutely. I've seen kids, I know kids that have been able to do that. I just want people to be thoughtful in the decisions they're making to see, am I developing a person who will be an adult at some point with a more complete psychology? Because you can only play sports for so long, or you can only do things for so long. And I think it's something that I see as a real tricky, complicated thing. And a lot of times it's chasing, I don't know, I'll get off that trail. But peer interaction. So this is what I was talking about earlier about the pack animal idea. And this idea of belonging to the group. Okay? This is one, investing in the future. Why is peer interaction investing in the future? And this sounds morbid, but it's because, like, your parents are going to die first in a general situation. So you got to go find a new group. You got to go find people to build a life with. Because you can't build a life with someone that's going to not be there, or even if they're there, they're not capable of participating with you in your life fully. So what you do is you go build a social group. You go have relationships. You date people. You have friends. Those kinds of things. And what's interesting about this is research indicates that our brains react to social exclusion similar to the threat to our physical health. Isn't that interesting? So if we have a young lady who is being pushed out on Instagram, one of the examples of, it was a young lady I worked with several years back, but she was having some trouble with her friends, and one of the things that they would do to each other is they would freeze each other out. So they would tell, like, if they're doing the kind of mean girl things to each other, they'd say, like, don't like any of her stuff. And they would tell all the kids, don't like her stuff. So, like, if she posts anything, don't like her stuff. So they would freeze her out, is the way that they would say that. And if you scanned her brain as she was being frozen out, her brain would look at that similar to as if she's being physically threatened. Now, why is that the case? If you go back to the evolutionary principle that being pushed out of the group is, in an animal kingdom, is dangerous because now you're susceptible to predators and other and the elements. when we're people and we get pushed out of the group, now we're in danger. And that's why belonging to a group can actually create a sense of safety. And that's why an adolescent will compromise elements of their personality sometimes to belong and do things that may not be consistent with their personality or their values because they want to belong, because belonging creates safety. I remember, some of you guys might be old enough to remember this. Remember when emo was a big thing? You guys remember emo? Where like, there's a whole big, I used to do a lot of therapy with kids that were big into emo. And they'd walk in, it'd be like 100 degrees outside. And they'd walk in with like black coat and a hoodie and come in like dripping sweat. And I'd be like, you have to be miserable. And sometimes if I had a good relationship with the kid, he'd be like, I am so hot. Right? Like, but what happened is they would wear this outfit in a way, and now I'm not saying that it was a complete fake or front. What I'm saying is they might have agreed with elements of it, but there might be times where they kind of do the things in order to belong because now I have my group. And athletes do the same thing. Performing arts kids do the same thing. It's the primary driver that makes gangs so appealing to kids because what did we create? We create safety and belonging. And for some kids, the reason why gangs can be so effective, they can create a sense of family. And they can create a sense of, we will protect you. But these are the compromises you're going to have to make to show that you will belong to our group. Because for some kids, and some kids I've worked with, that it was legitimately a way to protect themselves physically, was to compromise certain elements of their ethical values to belong to this group that would protect them in the environment that they live in. And that's a very real sense of how that responds. Here's an interesting thing. You guys ever heard of Grand Theft Auto? Remember the game Grand Theft Auto? Okay. Grand Theft Auto, they did a research study, it's been several years back, and they put a 15-year-old in a room, and they had him play a level on Grand Theft Auto. But Grand Theft Auto is a game where you can go around and do various things of different moral expressions. But one of the things you can do is tasks. So you have to steal this car, which obviously starts off not as the most pro-social thing you can do. Steal a car, do this mission, and then you get points for completing the mission. So they have a 15-year-old, do this mission. They do the mission, and then they measure their risk-taking based when they're played by themselves. And then they would put them on a similar level, but put 3 of their friends in the room with them and have them play a similar level of complication and have them play Grand Theft Auto again. And they found that their risk level went up, different kids, up to a third to a half if people were watching them, if their buddies were watching them. So what that shows you is, by themselves, they might take a certain level of risk, but you get people looking over my shoulder, especially my buddies, I will do things that I typically wouldn't do by myself. Now, here's where that gets tricky when you start thinking about technology and apps and things like that. Kids are constantly publicly presenting themselves, so I will present things on Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok that really I wouldn't typically do because I'm trying to present myself a certain way to my social group. And that's there's a concept with influencers that they call audience capture. Has anybody ever heard that term before? Audience capture. It's where I will present things to the audience, and if they respond to certain types of posts or certain content, I will lean toward more of that content because that's what people are responding to. And that's where you'll see posts become more promiscuous or more risk-taking. It's because the audience starts to capture me, and I start to become what the audience wants me to be based on what reinforcers they give me. So that's something that you kind of think about. And also, they're highly responsive to oxytocin. Oxytocin, the easiest way to think about it, is they call it the moral molecule. But the thing with oxytocin, what can facilitate oxytocin is it creates bonding. So kids are highly susceptible to dopamine, which is kind of the feel-good chemical, and then oxytocin, which is like the bonding chemical. And the things that trigger high levels of oxytocin are physical touch and focus, or how should I say it, intent. The highest levels of oxytocin you can find in the human body is a mother and a baby immediately after birth. Highest levels of oxytocin you can find. So you do a blood draw on a baby, you do a blood draw on a mom right after she's giving birth, oxytocin is going to be through the roof. Like when a baby's first born, where do they want to put the baby? Where do you put the baby? Chest, skin to skin, right? Because the two things that trigger oxytocin, which also has a painkiller in it, which is dopamine, is physical touch, skin-to-skin contact, and intent. So as soon as that baby's born, I want that baby on that mom's chest. I want skin-to-skin contact, and I want that mom making eye contact. I want oxytocin through the roof, because through the roof it facilitates bonding and has a painkiller in it. And I've never given birth, but I was right there and it looked rough. Looked like I'd want a painkiller at that time, right? Especially the natural stuff, the chemical stuff, load them up, right? So when you look at that, that's what they're trying to facilitate. But oxytocin in adolescents, they're hypersensitive to it, so they're hypersensitive to physical touch and intent. That's why relationships for adolescents can feel very, very intense. Especially early sexual behaviors or early sexual relationships can have very strong emotional content because of the flooding of oxytocin. That's why when you'll see kids that, their first time they have sex with someone, it can create a very strong bond, even if it's even a potentially sketchy social situation. But it creates because of the bonding and the level of oxytocin. But it's just stuff to think about. I think this is something I added into this that I think is relevant. And this is one of the things I want you to think about for adolescents, especially your middle school, high school kids. I was thinking about this as I was walking into our high school football game the other day. And I was walking by and the band, the drum line was warming up. And those kids were all together and they were warming up and they were very focused. And you could tell that they were really getting ready to participate. They were in their element. And I went into the game, and I was looking at the line, because my son plays on the line, and I'm a lineman mind. Look over, and I look at the linemen, and they're focused, and they're getting ready, and they're going to participate. And then we go sit down, and my mom was a cheerleading coach for years and years, so I know more about cheerleading than you would think, weirdly. So I'm watching and I also taught tumbling as a kid because my dad, again, was a gymnastics instructor. So it's a family business. It's what I did in high school. I taught gymnastics. But I'd see the cheerleaders warming up. They're dialed in. They're getting ready. And I think about, I'm like, this is, they found their thing and they found their people. And I think when we look at adolescence, I want you to really think about what we're doing to help kids find their thing and their people. Now, here's the thing that's tricky. I'm not telling you find their thing for their life. I'm find a thing. Like, it doesn't matter what the thing is necessarily, or that, like, oh, you're doing robotics, so that must mean you're going to be an engineer. No, it could be, I'm doing robotics because I'm 15, and I think it's cool to do robotics. But robotics becomes the vehicle where I learn how to focus on something, work hard at something, collaborate, and create. For me, I always tell people, because again, I was talking about sports. I don't want to be negative about sports at all, because athletics was the vehicle for me where I learned how to work hard. I didn't become a professional athlete. Even when I played in college, I played at Morehead State University. I didn't go to Alabama, right? I played at one AA school that, it was a regular little school place to play football. But sports was something that I learned that I was someone that would show up at 6 in the morning and lift weights, or on the day after Christmas and lift weights. And like that pattern is something that I transferred to other things in my life. The same thing with the arts. It can go with the arts. Doesn't mean a kid's going to play that instrument the rest of their life, but maybe that instrument is the thing that teaches them how to work hard, of helping kids find people that are similar people. But if they just find their thing involved. There are some kids we can help facilitate that best. That they just have to work with numerous kids with bigger, and there's more people high school to survive that, because high schools can be rough. You got to be around people you don't want to be around every day. And as we get older, we can kind of separate from that. But understanding that these are two things I would ask people to really think about, because they're protective factors. If you look at the Positive Childhood Experiences research from 2019, one of the things we know is there are certain things that protect us psychologically. And the positive childhood experiences are looking at things that help protect. And just to give you a few off the top of my head, belonging in high school is a protective factor. Participating in community activities is a protective factor. Having a non-family member, at least 2 adults that are not family members that I could share a problem or struggle with. When you do school threat evaluations, it's coming out of the stuff from the Secret Service and the FBI. One of the things you'll ask a kid in a threat evaluation is you'll ask for their pro-social engagement. You won't say it that way, but you'll say things like, tell me about your friend group. And what you're looking for is, do they have a friend group? And if so, is that friend group pro-social? Just because a kid has a friend group does not mean that won't increase their risk for violence at the school. If they have a friend group, but that friend group is antisocial, that makes them higher risk. An example, a lot of you guys remember Columbine. Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris had friend groups, but they had a friend group of antisocial kids that were anarchists who wanted to watch the world burn, all that kind of stuff. So just because a kid has a friend group does not necessarily mean it's pro-social. The second question I'll ask kids, do you have an adult that you feel like you could share a problem or struggle with? At least one. The more they have, the better. So what's your friend group? Do you have a relationship with an adult in this environment? One of the things, I'm sure you guys' schools have done this before, but I love it, is they do the dot activity where they put kids' names and pictures up on a wall, and teachers take little stickers, and they put a dot by kids that they feel like they have a good relationship with. Now, if you got a gigantic school, which it appears this might be one of those, it can be a little bit more complicated. But what they do is they put a dot, and then what you do is you look for kids that don't have any dots. And you go, those are the kids we got to figure out how to connect with those kids, because none of our staff feel like we have a good relationship with that specific kid. And the last question I would ask is, do you participate in any extracurricular activities or participate in school functions? So what am I looking for? Do they play sports? Are they in the band? Do they do performing arts? Are they in robotics? Even other than that is, do you go to football games? Do you go to school dances? Do you, I had one kid that would tell me when I was doing a school threat evaluation, he wouldn't even wear clothes with the school's name on it. It's like, I don't want to be associated with that school. So why is that important from a safety standpoint? Because what makes people dangerous for one group to the other is when the other group becomes them. That's what makes people dangerous. Because of us, you are less likely to perpetrate violence against us. But if you can create a them, you're much more likely to perpetrate violence on them. If you study history, it's proven time and time again. If you look at the Holocaust, you look at American slavery, or any slavery for that matter, you look at the way Native Americans were treated. It's different because the power group, viewed the non-power group as so different that whatever violence or negativity that they perpetrated against that group didn't involve them because it was a them. So if you want to create safer schools, create bigger us. And if a building is gigantic, it's hard when you have, let's say, 4,000 students in a school. You have to create almost like micro communities inside that school. You have to find ways to create micro communities. All right, so I'm going to go through here. I know we got folks coming in from the other sessions that were in the other session. They're coming into this one. This is something I will teach. I'm going to teach you like I would teach an adolescent about their brain. So I help kids be able to understand this. So the first thing I tell adolescents, I do a lecture for kids called 3 Things You Need to Know About Being a Teenager. And this is one of the first things I teach them, which is be careful of your monkey brain. So let's talk about monkey brain real quick. That's not an actual scan of a brain. I drew that on my iPad with Doodle Buddy. Because, I could have searched Google Images and found a brain like anybody else, but I think it's more useful if you don't have the other parts to distract you. The deep limbic system, which I refer to as your monkey brain. Nothing wrong with your monkey brain. People try to demonize the deep limbic system because a lot of emotion and all that stuff. Listen, the deep limbic system is useful. It's good, right? Here's what the deep limbic system does for us. It's emotional. It's reactive. It's about right here, right now. Passion, energy, creativity. We want this part of our brain. It's what makes things excited. It's what gives us focus, right? It can really help us. We'll actually trick our bodies into the monkey brain being activated. Think about what a roller coaster is. A roller coaster is you pay someone money to strap you into a device and scare and trick your body into thinking you're going to die. Your body goes into fight or flight, and we love it because of how those chemicals feel. Right? We love the idea of giving away some of that control. Or think about watching a scary movie. We love watching a scary movie. Why? Because it creates in us this safe terror that triggers. And now here's the thing. If you are watching a scary movie or you are riding a roller coaster, you can't think of anything else in the world but right here, right now. And that's why we like them, because they're a distraction. That's why we like this stuff, because it's a distraction. But we can't demonize the monkey brain, because the monkey brain's useful. But what happens, though, is all things seek balance, equilibrium, right? In order to counter the monkey brain, we can't just be right here, right now all the time, because there's a future us we have to be thoughtful of. So we have what's called the PFC, or the prefrontal cortex, or what I call is your Einstein. So there's the monkey brain, which is right here, right now, and then there's the Einstein, which is making sure to take care of future you. So the Einstein is logical. It's calculated. It thinks of consequences, thinks of long term. Now, here's the thing, though. Your prefrontal cortex, PFC, or your Einstein, doesn't finish developing until your early to mid-20s. So, yes, you're right. For guys, it's even longer. Yes, it's actually true. Adolescent or female brains, on average, develop faster, or females in general develop faster. But there is a period of immaturity that males can actually be longer. You can see that, especially in high schools. You see that more so than anything else. But anywhere, or usually about 25, you're pretty wired up. Now, here's the thing, though. I will say this is important. This is also an experience expectant neurology. What that means is your prefrontal cortex connects faster and more efficiently if you are in environments that facilitate this type of thinking. If you're in environments with regulated adults, if you're in environments where adults control their emotions and solve problems, or learn to think and talk things through, your prefrontal cortex will develop quicker. If you're in environments that are emotional and reactive and uncontrolled and undisciplined, your prefrontal cortex does not have to develop. And that's why there's a book called Parenting from the Inside Out, written by Dan Siegel, and he talks about parents who were in environments where there wasn't good regulatory adults. There wasn't adults that taught delayed gratification, impulse control, emotional regulation. They don't develop that prefrontal cortex, and they don't get that connection between the PFC and the deep limbic system, so it means their ability to solve problems becomes compromised. So a lot of times when we're working with a parent, and we're trying to help parents, especially that didn't have a ideal upbringing, one of the things that I have to really work with that parent on is when your child is in crisis, you are not in crisis. What I mean by that is, if I've got a 3-year-old who's flipping out because they don't want to brush their teeth, I have to look at that 3-year-old and go, they are in crisis, I am not in crisis. So the adult who isn't as effective is when the 3-year-old goes into crisis, they escalate with the kid. And then now we're both in crisis, and now the adult is solving the problem with emotion and not with logic. And not looking at the kid and go, he's going to be fine. He just doesn't want to brush his teeth because he doesn't want to go to bed. And that's a very typical 3-year-old kind of thing to do. So all my job is to stay steady and understand that I'm going to continue, I'm going to state the expectation, I'm going to stay in a very even place and go from there. Now, some of you guys might be like, well, yeah, I teach high school though. But how many times have you seen an adult escalate with a kid in adolescence where they're both escalating with the kid and fire with fire with fire because the adult isn't regulated? And I think that's also an example of that we can't give what we don't have. And sometimes it's the harder thing that kids need us to do. I'll give you a quick example. This is one of the ones that can be especially tough when you work with kids with challenging behavior. a kid has a rough day, and the kid comes back the next day. One of the things I know has a huge impact on relationships with kids is adults that hold grudges. Adults that hold grudges. So if I had a kid that had a tough day yesterday, he had his consequences, we're trying to start a new day, but that kid walks in the building and I say, hope we're going to have a better day today. How many times do you hear somebody say something like that? What that is, that's the adult not having regulation. Now, I can say that exact same thing in a different way that feels supportive. I have a kid come in, hey, come here. Let's talk about what a good day is going to look like today. Let's talk about what if we're going to have a good day today, what's that going to look like? Let's talk about what success looks like today. Let's get that in your head now. Let's start working on what success is going to look like today. Let's talk about what a good day is going to look like today. It's different than, I hope we're going to have a good day today. But who's that about? That's the immaturity of the adult. Oftentimes that need to be right, that need to, I want my pound of flesh kind of thing. I need you to, I want you to apologize to me because you hurt my feelings. Now, do I have a problem with kids apologizing? No, I don't have a problem with kids apologizing. But I want to think about, this is one of the things I always tell people, I never make kids apologize. And people say, what? I don't make kids apologize. Because I don't want to teach kids to lie. Because what starts to happen with some kids is they start learning that if I just apologize, even if I don't mean it, it's the magic words. And so if I have a kid apologize to me for something that they've done, I always acknowledge that they apologize. And I'll say, I appreciate the words that you had to say. I appreciate you saying that. But apologies have two parts. It's what you say and what you do differently. And to me, the more powerful thing is what you do differently. So I appreciate the words. I look forward to what you'll do differently. If you need more information about what it would look like to do it differently, I'm happy to coach you up. I'm happy to give you that information. But I appreciate the words. Because otherwise, if all we do is you have to apologize, we're teaching kids to lie. And I think that's something to think about sometimes. It just gives you an example of blue, the darker the colors. This is from the National Institute of Drug Abuse. You can just see as the brain, the cooler colors show more neurological development. You can see where that starts to come into play. Really interesting. So, where are places we have to be extra careful of our monkey brain? Social, sexual, and substance. These areas, or these circumstances, are high monkey brain situations. And it's because of these things. Social fear, which I've already dissected for you. Sexual flooding, which is the neurological and chemical experience of sexual arousal. And substance dumbing, which is how certain substances decrease neural activity in problem solving. Alcohol being a perfect example. Alcohol is a central nervous system depressant. I had kids tell me sometimes, well, that doesn't make sense. When I say it's a central nervous system depressant, like, well, why do people get happy when they drink? Well, for a period they can, because the first thing that the alcohol does is it shuts off the prefrontal cortex, which is a no-stop, don't part of your brain. That's why they call it happy hour. Right? Because alcohol takes offline the worrying part of your mind. Now, here's the thing. If you continue to drink at an accelerated rate, it will shut off all of your mind, which is called a blackout or passing out. But there's that sweet spot where people will like that feeling of what stress, right? So the idea is these three things. Now, if you think about a party, for example, that's where we got to be careful, right? Because there can be social fear, sexual flooding, and substance dumbing in certain circumstances, which means the likelihood of making a profoundly poor decision are really high. So these are the things I teach kids about how to analyze environments and look for these types of things that might be occurring. And here are some of the short-term consequences, or long-term consequences for short-term circumstances. I always tell kids, like, I've never worked with a kid that was just told they were, positive for chlamydia. I've never worked with a kid that they went, you know what? I knew he had chlamydia, but he was just so handsome I just couldn't help myself. Never had anybody willingly get an STD. It's usually they get caught up in a moment, they make a poor choice, and then that's the consequence of it. I have the handcuffs there. I had a group of kids that it was a public case that I was involved in back home, and a bunch of guys together on a sleepover thinking they're pranking their buddy. They'd all been drinking, and the first guy falls asleep kind of thing, and they start messing with this kid while he's asleep, but they're recording it. And then the things they're doing to him, they think is just messing with him, but actually the things they're doing to him are a felony because it's sexual misconduct that they're doing to the kid, and they've now posted on social media, so just publish the evidence toward their felony convictions. And one kid was 18 and the other two were under 18, and they all were charged with felonies. Now here's the thing that came out afterwards, but they're good kids. I've seen lots of good kids in courtrooms. But the problem is if a good kid does this sexual behavior to another person and it's published, then that good kid still has a felony. And I think, that's an example of social, sexual, and there was one of the kids I talked to that were involved in the group, and the kid's like, I knew it was wrong, but I just was so afraid that if I did too much that they'd turn on me. There's a lot of situations where that can be the case, where they'll go with something, but they're afraid that the kids will turn on them. And even if I just do the monkey brain side and all I do is play video games and don't do the harder thing ever, I used to talk to kids and be like, especially young guys that want relationships, I'll be like, listen, back when World of Warcraft was big, if you guys remember World of Warcraft, I'll be like, listen, man, I know you're like a 70-something death knight, and that's pretty fantastic and wow, but there's not a lot of girls walking through the neighborhoods knocking on doors thinking like, I really am looking for a 75 death knight living in their parents' basement because that's who I want to settle down with. It's like probably not the case. So you got to think about those things. And one thing I always pose to people is that we ever make bad decisions because of one or all of these things. Did you ever let social fear, sexual flooding, or substance dumbing get yourself in a not so great situation? And I think that helps us to develop some empathy. I tell you, I don't know about you guys, but do you ever have memories of yourself that you remember something you did and just thinking about it makes you cringe? You ever have that? Like, you don't even have to say it out loud. You just think it in your head and you're like, oh man, right? Anytime my kid does something stupid, I still will tell him he did something stupid, don't get me wrong. And I don't go, I did stupid stuff, get after it, buddy. I don't say that. But I also understand that I did stupid stuff too, so I've got to keep the focus on the learning. And sometimes consequences are part of learning. Sometimes I got to say, you did something stupid, here's the consequence when you do stupid stuff, but tomorrow we'll hopefully do not stupid stuff tomorrow. That's the goal, is minimize stupidity moving forward, right? But understanding that it's not because there are some broken person. And here's the things we teach kids to do: avoid monkey brain situations if we can, within reason. Make smart policies. What I mean by policies, I teach kids this all the time. What are your policies? I think why we don't do this in classes blows my mind. But like sitting down with kids and saying, let's start working on your policy and procedure manual as a person. Let's start thinking about the decisions you'll make and when you'll make them. I'll give you sometimes policies you make for yourself. Sometimes other people help you make your policies. Like I'll give you one example where other people helped me make a policy. When I was a kid, like I remember we were walking into the mall, and we're walking in with my mom and my dad. I might have been like, my parents got divorced when I was like, I think in 6th grade. So I was probably maybe 8, 9 years old when this happened. I'm walking into the mall, and I stepped in front of my mom to go in the store. And my dad bounced my head off the door frame, which I don't suggest as a parenting strategy. But he said, son, step in front of your mother, you hold the door for your mother. And I was like, understood. Yeah. But now, even today, if I'm walking to a door and there's a lady walking to the door, I have to hold that door. And sometimes I had one lady, it was funny, she goes, you don't have to hold that door. And I'm like, you don't understand. I have to hold that door. I have post-traumatic stress about this. I know you can open this door, but this is about me right now, and I need to open that door, or else this is going to be a problem. And so my dad helped me make that policy, like that I hold the door. And it's not just for women. That was what I was taught earlier. I hold the door for other people too, don't get me wrong. Another one I made for myself was I don't litter. It's a weird one. But the reason why I remember, I was 16 years old. I was driving behind a red S10 truck. I'll never forget this, on 52. Red F10 truck and S10 truck. And this guy throws an entire bag of McDonald's out the window. Trash on the road. And I thought, what a jerk. Like, what makes this guy think that he gets to throw his trash out? Like, what kind of entitled, I don't want to cuss, what kind of entitled person thinks that they should be able to just throw their trash out on the road? I'm like, I can't stand people that litter. In my head, I'm like, I don't litter. What we teach kids about our policies is, a policy is what you do because you've decided about it ahead of time, and it doesn't matter who's there or what the circumstances are because it's your policy. So I start teaching kids about their policy. I'll give you a quick example. I was doing a group with young adolescent females, and I said, you need to start thinking about what your sexual policies are. What you will or won't do and in what circumstances. Because if you don't make your policy now, and you wait till you're in that sexual situation, I can promise you that the person you're with is not going to have your interests in mind. So you need to decide now. Back in the day, they used to talk about bases, right? What element of your personality and your self-respect are you willing to do, and in what circumstance or situation that is an expression of how you value yourself and the decisions you make when it comes to making sexual decisions? And helping kids understand and make those policies. And also recruiting help. Having those conversations with kids and kind of bringing that about. One of the things we know that's affecting adolescent development at a high rate is we know sleep is one of the most important things they can have. I do a lot of work with athletes too, and I always tell kids there's 3 legs to the stool. There's training, nutrition, and sleep. Stress, feed, rest. And the same thing goes with any kid. Learning is stressful. We've got to feed them, we've got to rest. And I don't have to be too far on the soapbox of stress is, we know how to do that. That's teaching, that's training, that's that kind of stuff. Feeding, I'll be a slight aside, adolescent nutrition is terrible. Terrible. I don't mean to be like, but the one of the things if you have adolescents is you influence and you're talking to them, one of the biggest things we're seeing with adolescents right now is they don't eat enough protein. They eat a crap ton of terrible carbs, and they don't have enough protein. And the problem with that is, why that's so relevant is, their body's developing at a very, very accelerated pace. And if they don't have protein, they don't have the building blocks for the main things, which is your neurology and your muscles, all based on protein. And if I don't have enough protein, I just can't build it. It's just not there. So I think that's something, I don't know how we solve that problem. I struggle with that even with my own kid. Jake is my 18-year-old, and I had to send extra protein with him because, if he just ate the school lunch, and I'm not being negative about school lunch, but you look at a school lunch and you're lucky if there's 15 grams of protein on a school lunch. So figuring out ways, and especially back home, we have a lot of kids who have real social economic disadvantages. And protein's expensive. And when you're trying to get kids to have more protein, but it's really expensive and it's oftentimes perishable, we got to figuring out how to get these kids better nutrition. I mean, we give a lot of our boys back home, a lot of our boys eat a lot of peanut butter, right? Because peanut butter's cheap, it stays on a shelf a long time, and I can make a sandwich out of it and I can give that to a kid. But thinking about some of those things and getting kids to think about that in a way. Sleep, gosh, kids need anywhere from, depending on whose stuff you read. Matthew Walker's the best guy to read on this. Minimum 7, 8 to 9 if they can get it. What are the things that are interfering with this? We see the most of kids sleeping with their phones. This is not popular to talk about, especially adolescents. They will key my car if they hear that I'm talking about this. I'm telling one of the main things, and this is one of the best things to do to protect a kid, is that the phone gets charged in a different room. It's so hard. It is so hard. When you ask a 16-year-old to put a phone by their bed and say, don't check that. They're helpless. They can't do it. Most kids can't do it. There's always exceptions to the rule. But most kids can't do it because it's just too much. It's the same reason why I don't keep cookies in my pocket. Right? I can't be trusted. You get me at a rough point today, I'm going to have a cookie, right? So the same thing goes, if I put that beside this kid while he's sleeping, and they see that light going off, or they hear that buzz, have you ever, go to an adolescent and just say, can I just hold your phone on vibrate? I want your notifications on vibrate. Can I just put your phone in my pocket? And you will be amazed by the amount of notifications that they get in an hour. You'd be amazed. I don't know has anybody ever done that? Have you ever felt a teenager's phone? Is it? Yeah? It's unbelievably anxiety producing. Here's an interesting thing. I'll tell you a quick research study they did. It was really, really interesting. They took folks, psychologists oftentimes will tell you they're studying one thing, but they're studying something else. You got to watch psychologists, they're tricky. So they put them in a chair, okay, and they hook them up to this monitoring system that looks at heart rate, sweat, focus, and they give them a game to play. What they tell them they're doing is, we're studying your performance on this game, and as the game gets harder, we're looking to see what your stress response is to the difficulty of the game. They're lying. Got to watch them. And then they said, but what they're really studying is, they take the research student, and they put them in the subject, put them in the seat, give them the game, and then they say, you have to stay in this chair because the way we measure your heart rate is with this system. And if you get out of the chair, it throws off the instrument. And we have to take your phone from you because it'll interfere with our instruments. But we'll set it right over here. That way you know where your phone is. So they get the subject to start playing the game. And then they start texting their phone. And the phone, they can hear the phone and the notifications going. And they watch this person's heart rate increase. They start to sweat. And their performance on the game starts to drop. Because what is their brain thinking about? What's going on with my phone? You ever see that in a meeting? You ever see somebody? Now here's what's even more interesting. Another version of this same study is you let them keep their phone. And the researcher, on purpose, but looking accidental, leaves their phone on the same table and their phone starts to get notifications. What do you think starts to happen in the subject's body? Same response. Their anxiety goes up, their heart rate goes up, their performance on the thing goes down. So it's not even just your phone, it's other people's phone. Have you ever been in a meeting and someone's phone's like going off and you're like, do you need to get that? When it's probably just like a Kohl's coupon? Or the person that has their notifications go off on every email, that wears me out. I'm like, really? You have a bell for emails? So we really got to think about what are we doing in regards to that is, how is that disrupting sleep? And we can study that stuff. We can see that stuff. And the other one is video games, like letting kids play games late into the night. That's another area where we see disrupting sleep. So that's a big one. All right, let's talk about relationships. Here's my advice to relationships for kids is do not be a relationship blob. What do I mean by that? I said kids' jobs in adolescence is develop their identity. Here's the problem with that. In order to develop my identity, I have to get my self-concept with content. So I got to figure out what I'm like, what do I like to do, what music do I like, what decisions do I make, that kind of stuff. The thing that worries me sometimes is when we have these adolescent relationships that are like mini marriages. Now, is it possible for adolescents to have a relationship that is very functional and long-term in late adolescence and early adulthood? Yes. But what I see that worries me sometimes are some of these relationships where they're too enmeshed, like they're too integrated. It's like Tommy and Tammy. Tommy and Tammy have been dating since they're freshmen, and now, Tommy, what's your favorite color? It's Tammy's favorite color. Tammy, what's your favorite color? It's Tommy's favorite color, right? And all this stuff where they become enmeshed, where they don't really know who they are without the other person. Now, the problem with that is, I call it the Jerry Maguire myth. Is that whole "you complete me"? That's actually very psychologically unstable to say to somebody. Because you complete me means I'm incomplete without you. Which, if you think about it from a business standpoint, do you want two failing businesses to combine? Or do you want two strong industries to combine? So I don't want like two dysfunctional people creating, because it doesn't create a functional union, it actually creates a more exaggerated dysfunction. When adolescents, what I can be careful about is if we become too enmeshed, it compromises the development of my identity. How can you tell that's the case? Well, there's some element when I worked with some young people, they develop such a dependence on relationships. Here's one of those indicators. They can't ever be single. So as soon as they break up with someone, they got to find someone else to date because they're so uncomfortable with the idea of not being in a relationship. You ever see a kid like that? And what that signal is I'm not enough by myself, which that psychology is very dangerous. So I want to really think about that. Well, where do adults play into this? I think this is something I'm seeing more and more that I think we need to think about is, as adults, we have to be careful that we're not pushing relationships in a more accelerated way. So, for example, I promise you when I say this, it's not as mean as it sounds. I treat my son's girlfriends like stray dogs. There's more to it. I love dogs. But if you have a stray, you don't get to keep them. So don't get too attached because you're not going to keep them. So generally speaking, my son's girlfriends are more than likely not going to be the people they marry. So I am kind and polite and all that. But I am not treating them like they're my kid. We are not going on vacation together. We're not going to have blankets made with them in love together on them. Like, we're not doing all that because here's what happens. Here's the danger of that. And that's just the reason why I feel this way so strongly about it is it's hard enough as an adolescent to try to navigate a relationship, and it's good practice for them. But what I don't want to create is this sense of a family unity where now I'm best friends with her parents, and we do everything together, and we go on vacation together, and we do X, Y, and Z together. Because now, if my son wants to break up with that girl, not only is he breaking up with the girl, he's breaking up families. Or the girl is breaking up families, which adds a layer that should not be there for an adolescent. But have you seen these relationships that the families actually accelerate it even more so than the kid? Am I delusional, or does that happen? It happens. Okay, just making sure I'm not the one. And so what we want to think about is, I want the adolescent relationship to be what it is, which is an opportunity to learn about relationships and what I like and what I don't like and what kind of person I want to share my life with. Now, if I always think of it this way, if my son ends up marrying the girl he's dating, I have plenty of time to get to know her. I'll get to know her later, right? I'll appreciate her, and she's great and all that kind of stuff, but I don't want to create unnecessary burden on that kid at a time when it's not what that's for. So I think that's something to help kids think about, or help adults think about, that we're not perpetuating that moving forward. And I'll tell you what freaks me out even more than that is when I see it in the elementary ages. And I'm seeing some of that. I see like young kids and these acceleration of, oh, they're going to get married. Do not say stuff like that. That is ridiculous. You know, really allowing kids to explore that idea. It really worries me. It's funny. On average, 2 to 10% of high school relationships last. Listen, but there is a percentage. Can you marry your high school sweetheart and be happily ever after? Absolutely. Absolutely that can happen. I'm not telling anybody that can't happen. It absolutely can happen. It's just highly unlikely. I'll never forget, I was speaking at a school in Wheeling, West Virginia. They had their whole student body in there, like 1,200 kids in a place like this, but real big, a little bit bigger than this actually. And I show this statistic. and there's a couple sitting in front of me, clearly very close. I mean, they were like connected. And this slide comes up, and I watch the girl grab his leg in a very aggressive way and point at the slide and goes, "That's going to be us." And he was terrified. I always wonder what happened to that kid. One thing I will say is, I think it's when it does work, is when both people can be in a relationship, but also develop their sense of self. I think that's when it works. I'll never forget, I learned so much from the people that I worked with at the time. I had a lady that I worked with clinically, and she when I was doing therapy with her, she was 42, and her husband had gotten married right after high school, and her entire life was supporting him. And she came to me, and she was like, they got divorced because he had a relationship with another person, and so on and so forth. And she came into therapy, and she goes, "I need your help I don't know who I am. I have no idea who I am." She goes, I never went toward a career. I've never, I don't have any friends other than what I did with, I don't have any idea of who I am because all I've ever been is his wife. And now I have no idea who I am. And it was a really, really difficult thing because her personality was so enmeshed with his personality that I think a real healthy thing is to have that. It's a mutual support and respect, but also some level of separation and support. So it's something to think about. When will kids do some of the craziest stuff you'll ever see them do? It's after they break up. I've seen some of the craziest stuff kids will do after this. And I always tell kids, this is my best advice. If you have a kid who's just broke up with someone, the worst thing you can say to them is, the worst thing you can try to do is move past it. The one thing you want to do is acknowledge their feelings. Don't say what about that nice boy from church camp? Won't you call him? They don't want to hear that. They don't want to hear it. Sometimes you know what they want to hear? This sucks. And it's going to suck for a little while. And some days it's going to suck more than other days. If you think back to even your own, I don't know about you guys, but you ever have a breakup when you're a teenager that just completely rocked your world? And you're driving down the road and Open Arms comes over and you got to pull the car over, right? If you don't know what Open Arms are, you're probably you're under 40 probably. But you couldn't imagine, you can't go forward because it was just this person. You probably prayed to God at night that, I remember one time, this is embarrassing to say, but I'm a grown man now, so it's okay. I remember one night I was I was probably 16, and me and my girlfriend had been dating for a long time, broke up, and I remember thinking I said, all right, I promise God I will be a good person for the rest of my life if we'll just get back together. And I'm can't make those kind of promises at 16. But the only thing that you're thinking of is I just want to not be uncomfortable. This hurts so bad that you just want it to be over. So the best thing you can do with a kid is just kind of get in it with them. Just kind of say this is going to suck. And maybe there'll be a day where it'll suck a little less. And then if you need to talk about it, that's fine. But I had a boy I'll never forget. I'm from a very rural community. And I had this big kid. The mom brought him in to me. We had a familiarity with the family or whatever. And they said he didn't want to come to therapy, but they told him that it was this guy that does therapy, blah, blah, blah. And they were worried about him. And because him and his girlfriend just broke up. And so they bring him in. And this kid, he's bigger than me. He was 6'4", 270, big football star kid. He comes in, he's got the camo hat on, and he's got the fishing hook thing on it. He's just big, burly-looking kid. And he sits down, and he goes, I don't want to be here. And I said, that's completely okay, buddy. And I said, but you're here, and one of the cool things about the place and being with me is you can say things as long as you're not going to hurt yourself or somebody else. Everything's confidential in here. If you got anything on your head, sometimes people have found that talking to me can be helpful, and I might be able to help give you some insight. And he goes, he's like, but you come here if you're crazy. And I'm like, nope, not if you're crazy. You come here just to help work things out. And sometimes, you can't talk things with your parents, whatever it might be. And he says, all right. And he looks at me and he goes, if I tell you something, do you got to promise you won't laugh? And I said, nope. He said, what? And I said, I don't know what you're going to say, buddy, and I'm not going to lie to you because you might say something I think's funny, and I might laugh, and I'm just not going to lie to you. And he goes, well, I want to tell you something that happened. He goes, me and my girlfriend broke up the other day. I said, that's what I heard. I said, I heard it's been pretty rough on you. He said, yeah. He goes, I think I'm going crazy. And I said, what do you mean? He goes, well, this is like this time of year. It was right before deer season. And he goes, well, we were dating, and like I never had a girlfriend. Like we dated for like 6 months, and I've never dated anybody that long. And he goes, I really like her a bunch. And he goes, we were dating, and she said we had to have a song. And he said, I didn't really care if we had a song, but she said we had to have a song. You guys remember the Taylor Swift song, Our Song? You know what I'm talking about? Okay. He was like, so that was our song. And he goes, I thought it was stupid. He goes, but whatever. She wanted us to have a song, we'd have a song. And he goes, I'm at Walmart the other day, and I'm standing in the hunting section trying to get my stuff ready for deer season, and that stupid song came on. And he goes, I started crying. And I said, but he goes, look at me, man. I can't be crying in the hunting section at Walmart. What is wrong with me, man? And this kid's like an all-state line. I mean, we're talking. And I said, dude, I'm going to tell you right now. I said, I know it'd make you uncomfortable, but I would love to give you a hug. I'm not going to hug you, don't worry. And I said, it sucks. It sucks. And he said, I'm going to break someone. And I'm like, because she had a new boyfriend. He goes, I'm going to break him. I'm like, you can't break people, buddy. You just can't. We're not going to break people. But you validate that you feel that upset. I get where you're coming from. And I think, I always tell kids, like, this idea that it's hard and all these elements that come into it. But, this is one thing I have to teach kids especially. There's a fine line between I miss you and I'm hiding in the bushes in your front yard. Right? And I think what we have to do is help kids validate their feelings, but monitor their behaviors. Because I've seen kids do some really not good stuff because their emotions are high, right? And their decision making is low. So really help kids out in this situation. So I hope that's just something I want you to think about and help kids. Let's talk about technology, and this will probably take us to the end. The big thing about technology is 2 elements of technology that are critically important these days. One is experiential deprivation. The other one is content impact. So let's talk about experiential deprivation for just a minute. What are these kids not doing? What are they not doing? Talking. What else? Interacting. Teenagers would argue with you and say they are interacting. They could be. Well, here's the thing that I think is interesting. Even if they would argue with me, even if a teenager would say, we are talking to each other. We're texting, snapping, whatever it is. We're actually interacting with each other. I would argue, though, but they're not interacting with each other at the fullest social capacity. So if we think of a full social experience as 100%, they're interacting at 40% of social capacity. So that could be the argument that I would make in that situation. And they're not really interacting, except the one kid's kind of creeping on the girl's phone beside him. Yeah, he's that guy, right? But one of the things that we're seeing here is, it's when I talk about technology, I'm not necessarily in the beginning, we're not just talking about what apps they're using. We're talking about what they're not doing while they're on their phones all the time or on technology all the time. Similar thing about they're not going to social situations. So I can have kids who are socially, emotionally delayed because of the experiences that they're not participating in. Does that make sense? So all those things I said earlier, risk-taking, novelty-seeking, relationship building, all that stuff, they're not doing those things in adolescence when it's the time that they're supposed to be doing that stuff, which means they're behind when they go into adulthood because they haven't been fully experiencing socially the situations that they're supposed to be in. So that's number one. That's why we want kids out and doing things and interacting. That's why we got to help them find their people and their thing. Because when they're doing their people and their thing, they're participating more. I will say this. Let me make this point really clear. I think this is important. A lot of this stuff has to do with what expectations we place on kids. And do we give kids opportunities to interact and opportunities to be social? I've found that kids actually, when we create I've worked with a lot of schools in Michigan, Virginia, all over. that schools that have created policies that restrict cell phone use or actually eliminate cell phone use. Every school that I've worked with that have restricted or eliminated cell phone use have all reported positive outcomes when it comes to the increase in social engagement of students. I do some work up in Mount Pleasant, up by CMU, and their middle school got rid of cell phones. And what was interesting about that is they said it was amazing to them how the kids came alive. Like in the hallways, like kids were talking to each other. In classrooms, at the end when there was time, like downtime, they actually had to tell kids to quiet down some because they were socializing with each other. And the relationships between the teachers and the kids improved because the kids were now more social. And lunchtime became a social environment again and not just catching up on all my socials. And I think when we create that space, I'm amazed by how kids will actually, now that doesn't mean they're always pumped about it, but what I found is they will adjust to it if we create the space for them to be social. So I don't think kids are necessarily a lost cause. I think we got to create circumstances for success and development. I think that's a real powerful thing. I'll get ahead of myself just slightly and give you an example of one that is a little simple one we did at the family level. Is if we decided if you're in the car and it's under 30 minutes, no AirPods. We're not going to have AirPods in. We're going to do weird stuff like talk to each other. I remember I was picking up the boys from, before Jake had his license, I was picking up the boys from practice. And Jake gets in the car, and his buddy gets in the car behind him, Ethan. And Ethan gets in, and Jake knew the rule of under 30 minutes, no AirPods. So Ethan's sitting behind Jake, and Ethan goes to get his AirPods out. And I go, Ethan, here's the thing. If you're going to ride home with me, here's the weird thing about it. We don't know AirPods. We're going to talk on the way home. Just talk. Ask how your day's going, that kind of stuff. Ethan's a great kid. Sounds good. Puts his AirPods away. A little while later, another kid goes to ride home with us. John, and so I can't see John. He's behind me. Okay? So we get in the car. Jake jumps in. Ethan hops in. John jumps in. And I can't see John, but I hear Ethan go, John, no AirPods on the way home. We're going to talk about our feelings. Now, what's crazy about this is the boys, I literally, they just got in the car and knew that's what we're going to do. And it was amazing how now, were there days that were more quiet than others? Sure there were. Were there days where they weren't? But when you create that space, it's amazing how they'll jump into it. All right, let's talk about different social media platforms and the impact we're seeing from a neurological. If you haven't read the book, The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt, I encourage you to do so. Really powerful book. Really powerful book. I think there's two books that I would put together. Read Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, and if you want to go into a deep dive into the neurology of certain addictive behaviors, read Dopamine Nation by Anna Lembke, Lembke. Anna Lembke. She's a psychiatrist out of Stanford. So we're going to talk about each one of these. One thing I love to remind people, especially teenagers, is if you aren't paying for it, you're the product being sold. I like to stir up adolescents' resistance to that and tell them, like, you know why Snapchat's free? It's because they're selling you. Or you know why TikTok is free? It's because they're selling you. What is being sold with these apps is our attention. They are selling our attention to marketing people. So we can't, that doesn't mean you should delete it all from your phone and never use it. You should just you should know that that's what's happening. That your attention is what's being sold. And that the systems that govern it have no conscience. The algorithm behind, like TikTok, for example, what its job is to increase the duration and intensity of your interaction with TikTok. So it wants you to use TikTok more and interact at it. When we talk about intensity, what's intensity? Intensity is liking, commenting, sharing. That's why on YouTube they'll say like, subscribe, and comment, because there's monetary increase by the amount of interaction that video gets. So there's a view-based element, and then on the other side there is the intensity-based element. So as you watch TikTok, that video behind it, if you can imagine, has all these tags behind it. Is there a cat? Do people fall down? I don't know. All the stuff. And then what happens is that computer, the algorithm, the artificial intelligence, is collecting, as you watch it, the tags of the video, how long you watch it, and with what intensity you interact with that video. And then it starts to distill, and it's amazing how fast it can do this, distill what kind of videos you're more likely to watch. And then it starts to feed you what you eat. And it's doing it at such a fast rate that you don't even realize it, that it starts to move that way. So that's what it does. So what happens is this element of dopamine starts to come in. When I talk about digital dopamine, dopamine is, of course, we talked about it earlier, it's a neurotransmitter. It's involved in pleasure and movement. That's what it does. You actually have a tonic level. Like there's a baseline level of dopamine that most people have. Some people have lower baseline dopamine. Some people have higher baseline dopamine. There is some connection to that with depression and likelihood for addiction. It has a biological element, but that baseline can be reset. Because one thing we know is what goes up must come down. So when you have high levels of dopamine, so if I do something like eat a cookie, which gives me high levels of dopamine, I will have a seesaw effect, I should say it like this. It'll go up, but then it goes down in a proportionate amount. That's why, like, after you get done doing something really fun, you kind of have that dip, because what goes up must come down. So there's that seesaw effect that comes in. There's an example. Now, what's tricky, though, is if you do something, like use a drug, the first time you use it, you might get a really high peak, and then it troughs. And if you use it again, it'll go up, but it won't go as high as it did last time. And then it goes down, and then it goes high, which is the development of tolerance, which then means my dopamine baseline can drop. And I'll show you how that works with specific things. But here's the thing to remember. Substances or experiences with low effort and high dopaminergic or reward response can be highly addictive. So if it's easy to get, but has a big reward, it's more likely to be addictive. It's like, for example, cocaine. I don't know how easy it is to purchase cocaine. I'm not a regular purchaser of cocaine. However, the use of cocaine is easy. If you use cocaine, you get a huge dopaminergic burst. So the effort is low, but the reward is high, which means cocaine is highly addictive. But people don't get like addicted to doctoral degrees. Right? Because they're hard to get. It takes a long time, so you don't get addicted to those things because the interval's too large. So think of things that are easy to get, but hard. That's why food can be so rewarding, is because it can be easy to get. It has a real dopaminergic response, so you can actually develop an addiction. Let's talk about TikTok first. Let me tell you what. TikTok is for real. TikTok is super wicked smart and super strong. I remember as a couple Christmases ago, Jake was like, "Hey, Dad, you got to check out TikTok." I'm like, "Well, it's mainly just like dances and stuff, though, right?" And he's like, No. He's like, "It'll feed you what you eat." So I remember it's like beginning of the holiday break, Christmas break. It was like December, whatever, 15, 16, something like that. And so I downloaded it on my phone and start messing around with it. Next thing I know, it's like January 6th. I don't even know what anybody got for Christmas, right? Slightly joking, but it's amazing. I found myself, and this is something when I know I don't need this thing in my life at all, typically, or not much at all, is I'll say, when I'm doing it, and as I'm doing it, I'm asking myself, why am I doing this? Because I've worked with enough people with addiction to know that's a common psychology of people that someone will be buying the drug or using the drug, and while they're buying it or using it, asking themselves, why am I doing this? So when I found myself interacting with TikTok in that way and saying to myself, why am I doing this? I'm like, this is not something I want on my phone because it's smarter than me. I'm perfectly comfortable in admitting that. It is smart. If I let my brain play with that thing, my brain will lose. I don't like where it puts me. I don't like what it creates in my psychology. And It's easy to shame people. It's easy to like shame people that develop addiction. It's easy to do that kind of stuff. But if you really think about it, it makes sense. Like, have you ever been like tired and hungry after a long day at work because you haven't eaten or anything? And as you're ordering food from McDonald's, you're like, this is going to be terrible. And then you're like, and give me a large chocolate shake. Right? You know better. You know you're going to feel like crap, but you're like, you know what? I'm in it for the dopamine. Let's do this. Right? And I think that's one of the things that you start looking at. Imagine, I used to work with, opioid addiction is still a significant issue. It used to be a gigantic issue where I'm from. But imagine, though, having withdrawal symptoms and knowing exactly what you could do to get rid of them. Imagine being sick as you've ever been, gastro distress, headache, all that kind of stuff, and you know that if you just get 30 milligrams of this thing, you'll feel completely fine. And how overwhelming that must be. So I call it dumb scrolling. A lot of people call it doom scrolling. I call it dumb scrolling because no one ever scrolling on TikTok has ever looked brilliant and intellectual. But the slow manipulation of thought, it is what we see kind of thing. Pornography, people don't like talking about pornography because it makes them uncomfortable, but it is wrecking the neurology of adolescent males. Do females use visual-based pornography? Yes. I'm not saying that females don't use it. What I'm saying is it disproportionately affects males. We can still have statistics. When I say, people will be like, well, but no, there are differences in the fact of how an adolescent male is more likely to use image-based pornography. Females are more likely to use what we call literary-based pornography. I always tell people, don't follow the social debate, follow the money. Who bought Shades of Grey? Was it who? The primary person that brought Shades of Grey were middle-aged women. Wasn't big country guys walking out of Walmart with their Shades of Grey. I can't wait to read this one. This is going to be great, right? I don't want to see pictures. I want to make them in my mind, right? That's not how it worked, right? That's true. Yeah, you're laughing because it's true. Here's the thing, and I have had females who were addicted to pornography, but more likely it's been males. And so it's disproportionately affects males. This is why it's so addictive. Significant dopaminergic response, easily accessible. It's the cocaine effect, right? And now, if you think about now versus times before, right? There used to be access to pornography was much more complicated because there was one computer in one central location in the house. And now, everybody's computer's in their pocket. And the protections are, they have clicked, they're 18 years old and they're in. I mean, a 10, 12-year-old can do that. So what we're seeing is this high potential for addiction. This is the part, and we'll get a little scientific here for just a minute, but I want you to hang with me on this. What also starts to affect their motivational systems is, as a young person uses pornography, they'll have dopamine isn't just about reward, it's about pursuit of a reward. So as you pursue a reward, you get dopamine along the way. So as a person is using pornography for the sake of climax, when they use it, their dopamine starts rising and rising and rising. And then at the point of climax, it peaks, okay? And then, but what comes up must come down. So then it comes down and then does what we call troughing, which just think about a trough. It dips really low. But a second element that is especially negative about the use of pornography is human beings, as an experience of mating, right, is they're supposed to have sex and then bond with the person they mated with. Because that's really the purpose of mating, was to procreate and bond and raise a kid. Like that, if you look at the very basic chemistry of it, or the evolutionary principle of it. So at the point of climax, the body in the male releases prolactin. Anybody knows about prolactin? They think about things like so. Prolactin actually will blunt testosterone and actually cause a calming and to facilitate pair bonding. So I want to blunt testosterone because I don't want all the things that come with testosterone at that point. I want this male to now settle and connect. Now here's the problem. If this is a 15-year-old kid and he's just used visual-based or video-based pornography and he's had this dopaminergic climb and now prolactin's kicking in. So now not only is he troughing, but his brain is trying to connect, and there's no one to connect with. So now I'm extra lonely and I feel like crap. So if you study that post-response after climax in an adolescent, what starts to happen is they feel like a pile of crap afterwards. Now, we also know that, remember, peak and it goes down, peaks and it goes down. So now the problem I'm running into is I'm now developing tolerance for pornography. So that's where this starts to come in. Because I've developed tolerance, what used to work doesn't work anymore. A six-pack's a case. A case is, liquor. And a liquor is now I've got a whole handle of vodka in order to just do anything. So what we're seeing is adolescents who are using pornography at an earlier point in life, by the time they're probably 15, 16, 17 years old, they are so habituated or have such a tolerance to pornography, they're getting into very extreme versions of pornography by the time that they're early adolescents or late adolescents. And so we start looking at these things where the fastest growing types of pornography are very extreme versions. Aggression-based pornostrophy, multiple partner pornography, incest-based pornography. Now that one's a little bit tricky because incest-based pornography is the big rise they see is in like step-parent pornography. And taboo-based pornography that's about relationships that shouldn't happen but they somehow happen or whatever it might be. So we're seeing, because what's happening is what, intimate partner sexual interactions might have worked in the beginning, but now they're habituated to it or tolerant to it, so now it doesn't even work anymore. It's not enough. And now they're also starting to find where actual real-life sexual encounters are not causing them to have any arousal in that situation because it's not enough because their brain's not calibrated for it. And I've talked with young ladies who have also said, like, they're having these early sexual experiences, and the guy's been watching these distorted senses of sexual encounters. I don't know if you've seen one of these videos lately. Don't raise your hand if you have. But they're usually not very realistic and long and drawn out. It's like, hey, I hear your TV's broken, and there they go. Right? And when you think about what a real appropriate sexual relationship starts with is, it's connection, and then boundary formation, and refusal, and all this kind of this dance that occurs, which is where you learn to respect the other person, you learn to respect the other person's boundaries, so on and so forth. It's not, I'm here to fix the pipe or whatever kind of thing. And what happens also, too, is now you've got young ladies feeling this pressure to participate in more extreme sexual behaviors because that's what the guy's used to watching. And it goes both ways. It's not just guys, but you can see where that would come into play. And if you look at, if you follow the money, which is always important, follow the money, one of the big groups that these companies are starting to target with, Viagra-type products are males in their early 20s. It used to be like the old man playing golf commercial, right? Remember that? Like the old man playing golf? But now they're targeting because they're having early onset erectile dysfunction with adolescent or early 20s, I mean. It's craziness. Think about it. And why we don't talk about it is because it makes us uncomfortable. But we need to be talking about that. Snapchat, one thing we know about Snapchat is Snapchat streaks can actually increase obsessive compulsive tendencies. You guys are aware of streaks, right? You know what streaks are, right? Kids can get really, really fired up about streaks. Streaks become social currency. It's like my streak with this person is evidence of our relationship. I've had kids who will hire other kids to keep their streaks when they lose their phone, and they will hire other kids and give them their logins in order to keep their streaks going. I've had kids whose parents would keep their streaks going while they're off at camp. I had a girl, this was a while back, I had a parent call me. Her daughter had charged $400 and almost, I think it's like $490 some on their credit card because Snapchat created this thing where you could buy your streaks back. And this girl spent almost $500 on her, stole her mom's credit card in order to keep her streaks. Like, unbelievable. But it creates obsessive compulsive tendencies. I'm obsessing about my streak. My compulsion is to, and the one thing that also is tricky about streaks is they're about quantity, not quality. They're taking pictures of the ceiling. They're taking pictures of the side of their head. whatever. It's not really a connection thing. It's just it's a quantity thing. It's numbers. It's not really that it's that big of a thing with you and I. It's just the fact that we've got this thing going. They find that, this is from Height's work, they find that image-based social media disproportionately affects females. Perfect environment for relational bullying, relational aggression. Adolescent males are more likely to be physically aggressive. Adolescent females are more likely to be relationally aggressive. That's where we get the term mean girls from. So that is what you're looking at. I mentioned to the young lady earlier about they freeze each other out, or they say like don't like her stuff or unfriend her or whatever it might be, is a way that relational aggression. Males will do this as well. It's not just females, but majority male. There's also the FOMO element of it, fear of missing out, which is in the past you might not have known if you're cool, but now if you have evidence of all the things you're not doing, you get to see all the stuff you're not invited to, which kind of deepens that cut and creates that. The unrealistic beauty standards always cracks me up. I'm 45 years old. This is not just a kid thing. And it always cracks me up when people my age post pictures of them and their child, and their face is as smooth as their child's face, who's 15. And I always think, like, who are you fooling? Like, we are not 15, right? I think there's this, but it's the social pressure. It's a social pressure of the highlight reel of your life is your pictures that you post. Here's one of the things I think is really interesting is a distorted sense of social value. I had a young lady I knew, great girl, great person. She's in college now, but she said to me one time, she goes, all right, behavior boy, answer this question for me. She was in high school. And she said, she was a debate person. She did debate. And she goes, I posted a picture of myself with my debate award on Snap or Instagram. This is a few years back. On Instagram. And she goes, and I got 75 likes on my post. A girl in my grade posted a picture of herself in a yellow bikini in the snow, and she got like 390 likes. What am I supposed to do with that? I said, wow, that's a good question. Because it is a good question, because that's the reality that she's living in. And I said, I guess my answer to that would be, how much of your value and identity do you place on the difference between 75 and 390, and who is the 75 and who is the 390? And I said, and I'm not saying that's an easy question to answer, but I'm saying that's the only logical way I think you can get through this kind of thing with a intact sense of self. And she's a real bright girl. She had already answered the question for herself before she asked me. She had a good support network. She's an unbelievably brilliant person. But she had already answered that. But I worry about kids that don't have people around them to help them answer those kinds of questions. And you know what I think? It's not about demonizing the girl that took the picture of herself in the snow. I worry about her. I worry about what element of her psychology leads her to believe that that is the way that she needs to create social value for herself. Because I think that's she needs support and she needs conversations. Because I don't know if that's, I don't want to shame her, but all at the same time I want her to feel like she's making decisions that are for her. And the real challenging thing here is every time you post, your evaluation is up for debate. So that's stuff to think about. Here's an interesting but terrifying statistic. This is, if you look at this, this is non-fatal hospitalizations for self-harm. These are boys. You can look at the trend line's pretty even from 2001 to 2015. Introduction of the iPhone would have been, with the forward-facing camera would have been right here. Here's females. This height brings this up, but the highest rise, the group that had the highest rise in non-fatal self-harm hospitalizations is 10 to 14-year-old girls. They had a 189% increase in non-fatal self-harm hospitalizations. This is my theory, and there's some good stuff that would support where this theory might come from, is I think we have younger and younger girls being exposed to stuff intellectually that they developmentally can't handle. They're seeing stuff at a younger age, and it's just more, it's a 10-pound idea and a 5-pound brain. I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean it in like a developmental way. They're seeing 10-pound standards of beauty and all that, and they've got a 5-pound brain, and they're just not ready for it, and it's overloading them. And they just can't. Huh? Yeah, I think it's even worse. I haven't seen the newest JAMA research and what they've released, but I'm sure it's worse. And one of the things we start to see, now what's interesting is 20 to 24-year-olds are pretty stable because they've already kind of sense of self. But I worry about the generations that have been exposed to this since they were in elementary school. Like, what do those 10 to 14-year-olds look like now? You know, what does that consider them look like? So you have to, it's at least a dramatic thing to consider. I'll mention AI real quick. I can talk about AI for hours. I don't want to talk about it for hours. What I will say is we just need to start thinking about how AI changes the way we think. I'm not saying AI is the devil. I'm just saying AI will change the way we think and interact with each other and the way we solve problems. I think being aware of that is important. I think considering what that comes into, one thing that I'm seeing that really worries me at the college level that I think we're going to see more of is artificial companionship, which is where kids who are struggling to build meaningful relationships with real people will develop artificial chatbots that they develop romantic relationships with a chatbot. And this isn't like a may happen. This is a is happening thing. We have more and more young people who are developing an intimate relationship with artificial intelligence because it's the way that they feel comfortable interacting. It's like, have you ever seen the movie Her? You ever seen the movie Her? Watch that movie, it'll scare the hell out of you. Because I have a kid right now that I know in his early 20s at the university who will tell you his girlfriend is a persona he created in ChatGPT. And he'll tell you that's who it is. That he doesn't believe in human investment because humans don't understand him enough. That his AI understands him better than any human could. And that's a pretty scary idea. So I don't know, maybe, you know. And also the danger and the inaccuracy of information. I think also if you're getting kids ready to go into the work world, is thinking about how that goes. Video games, really quick, it's a time thief. And it can create an avatar that kids will disinvest from reality and invest more heavily in their video game self, especially for males are more likely to go into the YouTube video game side of it as well. But what the video games do is give them a sense of accomplishment within the avatar of the video games. So it's things to think about. All right. So we'll show you the thing. There's the QR codes are up here if you want to see those. There's that if people need to see that as well. You know, if I had to tell you my takeaway point for this is to stay curious. It's the whole Ted Lasso thing, be curious, not judgmental. I think with adolescence and the environment that kids are living in these days, one of the best ways I know to build a relationship with kids is to let them teach you. Matthew McConaughey said this the other day, and I really liked it. He said, don't ask kids, how are you? Ask kids, what's it like being a teenager these days? And you'll be amazed by how much more willing they are to talk to you when you say, what is it like being a teenager these days versus the intensity of how are you? And I think being curious about what kids need these days, like I mentioned in the keynote, and helping kids navigate this really complicated world that none of us really know what we're getting into with the emergence of AI, TikTok, all that kind of stuff. I think it's things to think about. If you want a handout or anything like that, you can email me there, or you can go QR code, you contact me there, and I'm happy to help anyway. And I'm here the rest of the day if you need me. All right? Take care. Go to lunch. Yep.